Are you afraid of God?
No. But I'm afraid of you.
Anita Sarkeesian ended her Tropes vs. Women in Video Games series with a look at lady sidekicks. It brings to a close a series of videos that has rocked the world of gaming, as her adoring fans disguised as writers like to say. Not surprisingly, I have a different take. While her series had the potential to start a really interesting discussion about the portrayal of women in gaming, the real result was exactly the opposite. Actual discussion, actual dialogue about the interesting roles of women in video games, it's now impossible. She didn't start a conversation, she stifled it. Get ready, it's time for a Game Objective editorial. Sarkeesian uses her last Tropes video mostly to go after Elizabeth from BioShock Infinite. She calls Elizabeth a glorified door opener, and has this nasty little comment about Infinite's story.
As the game tells players a garbage story which suggests that oppressed people are just as bad as their oppressors, and that the truth is always somewhere in the middle.
She goes on to lament that while Elizabeth is obviously important to the narrative, in the gameplay she's reduced to providing ammunition or cheering for the protagonist. Now, let me take a step back here for a minute. I honestly did not want to make this video. There are always other people making videos about Sarkeesian anytime she puts something out, and honestly, her relevance in the gaming world has waned significantly. I debated with myself over whether I should give her the attention, but her portrayal of Elizabeth is such shallow criticism. It's the margarine of critical thought applied to a complex game and story. To reduce the work on this story from real people working to entertain us with their game to just garbage, that's not criticism, that's an insult. Look at this, check this out. After BioShock Infinite came out, there was practically a cottage industry on YouTube with videos discussing this story. This is a 25-minute long video just talking about the ending, with over 1.5 million views. There is so much to talk about with BioShock Infinite that to reduce it to a garbage story is insultingly shallow. This is not someone offering well thought out criticism of a video game. This is someone oversimplifying a complex story in order to fit her political talking point.
As the game tells players a garbage story which suggests that oppressed people are just as bad as their oppressors, and that the truth is always somewhere in the middle. But that's much too big a can of worms for us to open in this video. Let's just focus on Elizabeth.
And there is the problem you see throughout the Tropes series. You can't just focus on Elizabeth and ignore the quote-unquote garbage story. The story of BioShock Infinite is the story of Elizabeth. If your intersectional feminist studies requires you to completely remove the character from the context of the entire game, then your intersectional feminist studies is a bunch of bullshit.
But Elizabeth is an example of a female sidekick who is reduced to a tool. There aren't gameplay mechanics that allow you to have meaningful interactions with her.
Anita backs herself into a corner here and has to rely on talking about the quote-unquote gameplay mechanics. Forget that BioShock Infinite is really the story of Elizabeth and the realization of her powers and figuring out where she fits in this multi-dimensional world. No, instead focus only on the gameplay mechanics, where she is one of the first companions to not get constantly stuck on the environment or to run out into a crowd and get herself killed. Forget gameplay moments like this one, where you are running through Columbia and finding useful items in the back rooms of the buildings you enter. You find a guitar and the game lets you play it. What follows is what I thought was one of the more surprisingly touching scenes in gaming.
Will the circle be unbroken by and by?
Does that really look like just a glorified gatekeeper? At the time, in 2013, when BioShock Infinite came out, this was one of the most fully fleshed out companion characters in gaming. Real thought was put into her creation by real creators, and Sarkeesian dismisses it as garbage, not to mention willfully misrepresenting the story to be just about oppressed people are just as bad as their oppressors and the truth is always somewhere in the middle. But I get why Anita is making that argument, and why she's so belligerent towards Infinite. In the game, there's an uprising by a group called the Vox Populi, which largely represents the proletariat attacking the bourgeoisie. Sarkeesian likely identifies very strongly with the Vox Populi, and if you take a look at their description in the Infinite Wikia page, you can see why. Though the Vox do not claim to adhere to any particular ideology, their original goal was to breach the divide between Columbia's privileged few and the rest, erasing the social and racial boundaries imposed by the founders. And it's led by, and largely made up of, minorities. This is ambrosia to the political philosophy of Anita Sarkeesian. But then, in seizing power, the Vox Populi turn out to not be as benevolent as they initially seemed. She must have been thinking, why can't my team be the good guys? The thing is, there's plenty of interesting criticism to be had with BioShock Infinite. As I've said, it's one of the more complex stories in all of gaming, and there are so many interesting issues that we could talk about that Anita almost flirts with bringing up. Why did the Vox Populi turn out to be violent? Was the game's portrayal of racism meaningful? What's the role of women in Columbia? These are all interesting questions that are worthy of discussion and examination, but we don't get that with Feminist Frequency. We can't get that, because the legacy of Anita Sarkeesian is one that has stifled such conversation. There is no engagement with the public from Anita Sarkeesian or Feminist Frequency. You will see no @replies in their Twitter feed. You will, of course, see no comments on their YouTube videos, and you won't even see thumbs up or thumbs down on their videos. You might blame this on the people, the gamers, who are often downright nasty to her. And it's true, she does get a lot of shit. But the thing is, even in controlled environments, she's not engaging. You will not find a single interview of Anita Sarkeesian where she answers a challenging question. Not a single one. She only does interviews with people who are ideologically similar to her. Here's Jen Yamato doing a piece on her, and here's Sarkeesian promoting Jen Yamato's work. Here's GameSpot interviewing her. Take a look at the writer, Carolyn Pettit. Carolyn Pettit is now the managing editor of Feminist Frequency. The media, especially the gaming media, has utterly failed in its duty to seek the truth when it comes to Anita Sarkeesian. These are not journalists covering a subject, they're fanboys and fangirls writing propaganda to support someone they agree with. Ask her why she's anti-violence in video games when all the studies suggest that there's no link to real-world violence. Ask her how games reinforce real-world sexism when it's been shown that they don't reinforce real-world violence. Ask her about how she got Hitman so wrong. Ask her if she can truly offer fair criticism when she once said that it's just gross to go around shooting people in video games. Ask her any of a million questions that make her defend her work, which is just the most basic thing you can do with an interview subject. Instead, we get people like Stephen Totilo, the head guy at Kotaku, who actually graduated from the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. Here he talks about meeting her in person and emailing each other several times. Then much of what she showed in the videos rings true to him. He agrees with her. He's an advocate of her message. But you'll notice what he's doing here in this article where he talks about her wrapping up the Tropes video. It's subtle and it's almost clever. He's putting harassment and criticism of her work in the same sentence. He's associating the two. They're not even separated by a comma. They're combined with an and. She also received harassment and fierce criticism. Like fierce criticism is now a bad thing? I guess it is when her message rings true to you. A big part of the blame for the failing of Anita Sarkeesian and Feminist Frequency has to lie with the new media's utter incompetence. Can you really blame her for not doing a challenging interview when there's no shortage of cheerleaders out there willing to write puff pieces on her behalf? And she's been able to fund her projects, so it seems to be working for her. Whenever writers write, we love to tell a story. We love to present a narrative. The ironic thing with Anita Sarkeesian is that the narrative is always the damsel in distress or the defiant hero who is standing brave against the odds. Just take a look at Patrick Klepek's piece on Sarkeesian's legacy. Anita Sarkeesian's legacy, according to Patrick Klepek, is one of being harassed. And it's partly true. She certainly got harassed and she got threats, and that should never have happened. That should go without saying, but in this political climate, of course, you have to say it. But let's take a look at this one sentence in this article. It took me too long to pick up on that, the harassment. It took most of us too long. What the hell does he think he is? He's a games journalist, for crying out loud. What does he think, he could save the world with his games journalism? The answer to that question is yes. That's exactly what he thinks. That's what Totillo thinks. That's the same mindset that these other journalists have. And because these so-called journalists aren't out there questioning the shallow criticism of Anita Sarkeesian, that forces the public to question her instead. So you get a million videos out there deconstructing her arguments, of which this video is just another example. And these videos largely do well because there's a market for them, because the public knows that Sarkeesian's commentary is largely bullshit. These gamers jump all over these mistakes when they see them because the new media, the Polygons, the Kotakus, the Waypoints, they refuse to question her or challenge her. And the big problem in all of this is that this atmosphere that this incompetent media has created and Sarkeesian has abetted is one in which almost no game developer will step up to defend their work. I've talked to several game developers, many of them prominent, who every gamer has heard of, and they won't go on the record. And I don't blame them one bit. If they speak up and say, hey, I disagree with her about this point, then this new media will jump all over them. At best, they'll say that the developer can't take criticism, and they'll be damned lucky if they're not called an outright misogynist. The journalists will defend their friend, Anita Sarkeesian, whose arguments ring true, and that has created this festering political climate around video games where we're not allowed to have an intelligent discussion about the role of the vox populi. We're not allowed to dive in depth on the role of Elizabeth. There's obviously much to criticize about video games, and there should be room for disagreement. We should all of us be allowed to discuss them and to criticize them without harassment, without threats, and without fear of being labeled a heretic against social justice. My favorite philosopher, Plato, got it right. An unexamined life is not worth living. That goes both ways, for video games and for critics of video games. That's what I think. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. If you like this editorial, please subscribe to this channel where you'll find more of this kind of commentary and real, actual games journalism from time to time. Also, keep in mind that donations to our Patreon are what keeps Game Objective alive, and I offer my heartfelt thanks to all of you who have contributed so far. This has been Brad Glasgow with Game Objective. Thanks for watching.